Your sell or hold assessment report shows the date of generation and the month of market data that went into the assessment. In this case, the data used was accumulated over the month of August 2018. Note that the basis of the report is a comparison between your current properties market and the alternative market you selected earlier on the alternatives page. Now, the report starts off with a quick summary in case you're, an executive and you want a summary. In this case, the recommendation is to hold this property and not sell and buy in the alternative market. Over 2,000 property markets were considered based on that target price range determined by the sale proceeds. Despite there being over 500 of them with better growth forecasts than the property market under examination, the recommendation is to hang on, and for good reason, as the chart shows. The horizontal line shows that it would cost $35,000 to sell the property and buy an alternative. But the alternative market's forecast performance is not that flash. It looks like it will take 5 years to recoup the expenses of selling and buying again elsewhere. It's not until 2023 that we might get ahead. I say might because these are forecasts. If the alternative market was vastly superior, those exit and re-entry costs would be absorbed a lot sooner. That means it's too risky to sell and buy in the alternative market. So the recommendation is to hold. 3 years is the benchmark time frame used. If we can't be in a significantly better position within 3 years, then it's best not to sell and buy in the alternative market. In this case, we'd actually be worse off by about $1,000 in 3 years. Even after 5 years, there's not much to high-five about. Scrolling down, we see the report's table of contents with quick links to take you to sections of your interest. We've already seen the intro and summary. The report is split up into 4 parts. The first part explains how the report works, what it's based on, the model and nature of data used. The second part details your specific circumstances. This is where the bulk of the report lies and where the great insights into your circumstances reside. The third part offers some help if you want to go the extra mile and perform more manual due diligence. And the last part includes some important warnings you need to consider before making your final decision. Let's quickly scroll through part 1. You can read it in detail at your leisure later. Oh, by the way, if you haven't checked out a sample report, make sure you do that. The home page contains a link to obtain your copy of a sample report. Part 1 starts off with some important terminology. You need to be familiar with this since it's used throughout the report. The assessment is modelled on a comparison of recycling costs versus opportunity costs. Growth forecasts are crucial to the accuracy of the report. A lot of time and effort has gone into this. It's important you're aware of how this is done. Obviously, it's all based on supply and demand, and there's a list of some of the supply and demand metrics used. There's a fair bit of history to the supply and demand metrics, which has been analysed, and there's a section on reliability of the forecasts. A bit of a blurb on the alternative markets, which you should already be familiar with to get this far. If not, check out the tutorial on the alternatives page, which precedes this video. There's a bit more about the comparison market you chose in part 1, which finishes off and with a word on timing. All right, part 2. Here we get at the guts of the report. This is now specific to your current property, and later the report considers the alternative market you selected. There's a quick summary of the selling and buying costs should you decide to sell your current property and buy a typical one in the alternative market. And then there's a more detailed table. The important figure here is the $35,000 it will set you back to exit the market and re-enter. Income is pretty simple since it's based on weekly rent and a vacancy rate. Note that the yield is roughly 4.5% of the property's value. Expenses are broken down into a little more detail so you can see where your biggest pain points are. Note at the bottom, expenses are shown as a percentage of the property's value, just like income was. Before tax, this property is pretty much neutrally geared since income and expenses are almost the same. If you were to sell your property and pay back the mortgage and pay the agent their commission and any capital gains tax, you'd have $88,000 to play with. That will go towards your deposit, stamp duty, legal fees and other entry costs for the replacement property. And as you can see, the re-entry costs are $23,000. not leaving much for a deposit. However, in this case, the investor has $20,000 in an offset account, which would also be released on the sale of their current property. So, as you can see in the list of alternative markets, the replacement property's target price range is over $400,000. That's assuming a loan-to-value ratio of 80%, which is pretty common. Birkenhead was picked in the list of alternative markets to be the comparison for this report, which is highlighted in the table. Scrolling to the end, we come to a section that compares the investor's current property market with that of the selected alternative. This chart shows the demand to supply ratio of the alternative market in blue and the current property market in green over the last 12 months. Also shown in grey is the demand to supply ratio of the entire Australian property market as an average. As you can see, both markets have better than average growth prospects. The grey shaded region is the range of demand to supply ratios for all Australian property markets from best at the top to worst at the bottom. You can hover your mouse over parts of the report to see more details. Now, the next chart shows the change in typical values of houses in both the current property market and the alternative. There's a significant difference because the value of the investor's property in West Leederville is a lot lower than the median, about half in fact. It could be on a smaller block or be in a state of disrepair, but it doesn't matter to sell or hold. This chart is merely to show how typical values have changed in both markets recently. The comparison continues with a list of key metrics of supply and demand. Now we move on to the all-important forecasts, starting with capital growth forecasts. There's a lot in this chart and it's pretty important, so I'll go over every bit of it. You'll notice the legend at the bottom shows there are two property markets being forecast, the alternative and the current. The alternative is blue and the current is green, or aqua. I've been told it's aqua. There are two overlapping triangles on the chart. One triangle is in blue and the other is in aqua. The part where they overlap is dark blue. Looking at the left vertical axis, you'll notice it's in dollars. This is expected extra equity to be gained over the coming years, starting from zero right now. The reason why there is a shaded section for each property market is because the forecast is not just a single figure but a range. The upper edge of each shaded section is the optimistic growth forecast. The lower edge is the pessimistic growth forecast. So according to the demand to supply ratio for each market, the estimated growth forecast should lie somewhere between these upper and lower forecasts. This is based on the growth seen in property markets in the past that had similar demand to supply ratios. Again, you can hover your mouse over parts of the chart to see more details. All right, what does it all mean? This means that the growth forecast for both markets will most likely be fairly similar, but the alternative market is tipped to marginally outperform the current one. The key thing to take from this chart is that there is a large section of overlap. It's possible that the superior alternative market ends up underperforming the current property market. And although there's slightly more likelihood of the alternative market winning that race, the odds are nearly even. At the top of the chart, you can see that there's very little difference between the optimistic growth profiles of both markets. All right, let's continue on to the rent forecast. In this case, the current market is predicted to outperform the alternative, but again, there's not much in it. However, the expenses forecast shows the alternative market is predicted to have lower expenses. Now, you're combining all three forecasts together, that's value, growth, rent and expenses, we have the following net forecast. Notice that at the start, we've now factored in the costs of selling and buying. The blue shaded section starts in negative territory to the tune of $35,000. And although it quickly catches up with the current market, it never really gets ahead. The next section of the report gives some truly valuable food for thought. There's a set of paragraphs that walk you through some of the decisive aspects of the comparison. Each paragraph shows a symbol to the left representing the overall conclusion of that paragraph. The text of the paragraph explains why. Now, the first paragraph looks at your forecast net position after 3 years. It says you'd actually be worse off by over $900. You want to be better off by tens of thousands to make the risk of recycling your equity worthwhile. Now, the second paragraph measures pretty much the same thing, but as a percentage of the current property's value. The system wants to see a significantly better position gained for the investor before suggesting a sell. The third paragraph considers the count of alternative markets available that are forecast to put the investor in a better financial position after 3 years. If there are loads of them, it means the investor's current property market is pretty ordinary by comparison. But in this case, there are only 2. The system wants to see more than 40, ideally. The fourth paragraph compares the demand to supply ratio of both markets. And since there is a significant difference, the system gives this a tick of approval. This is one argument for selling and buying elsewhere, but we have 3 arguments so far to hold. The fifth paragraph compares the 3-year better off by estimate with the recycling costs. Ideally, the system wants to see that the investor would be better off by a large percentage of the recycling costs. So if recycling costs were $50,000, we want to be better off by more than $30,000 after 3 years. Now, that's not the case in this example, so there's a red traffic light to the left of this paragraph. That means there's a good argument for holding. The last paragraph compares the net forecast chart we saw earlier. It's looking for how much overlap there is. If the alternative market's worst case scenario was better than the best case scenario of the current property, then there would be a very solid argument to sell and buy elsewhere. But instead, the 2 shaded sections overlapped quite closely. So this paragraph puts the final nail in the argument to recycle. This property should be held by the investor. Note that the comparison we've just seen in this assessment report was for the alternative market selected by the investor in the page of the website prior to this page. That was the alternatives page. You can run as many assessment reports as you like, choosing different alternative markets. But usually the assessment has the most chance of passing if you select the top ranked market. For this assessment report, I didn't pick the top ranked market. The top ranked market would put the investor in a better position by $23,000. But I wanted to show a clear case when a hold is recommended. Just for fun, here are those 6 paragraphs again with the top ranked market selected as the alternative. The first 2 paragraphs have clear arguments for holding. Then there's an argument for selling. Then there's consideration, which is uncertain, and another argument for selling, and one more for holding. So overall, even after picking the best possible alternative market, the suggestion by the system is to hold on to this property. Part 2 finishes off with a copy of those charts from the executive summary that we covered earlier. Now, just quickly, there are 2 more small parts of the report. Part 3 provides some advice on further research you can conduct if your case is not so clear-cut. If your assessment report has suggested a sale, it can be confronting. Further research to dot the I's and cross the T's might help. So the report contains a checklist and some research resources. Now, Part 4 is not just the stereotypical waiver of all responsibility. It actually highlights some really important details about your specific circumstances that you need to consider before making your final decision. You can read through these in a copy of the sample report in your own time, but I just want to cover a couple of quickies. Your specific strategy has only just been touched on in the alternatives page. You really should probably consult a professional if you're at all unsure. Secondly, you must get up-to-date credit advice to ensure you can borrow to buy the alternative. And thirdly, the system doesn't consider renovation, subdivision and development potential of your current property or the alternative. If you pick an alternative with plenty of this type of potential, you could actually be better off selling and buying elsewhere, even if all the arguments are to hold. Scrolling down further, there's a great section highlighting that there are always risks with investing. No matter how solid the arguments and the insights are in this report, there will still be risk. being aware of those risks is another thing you should consider before making your final decision. And finally, there is the disclaimer, which basically says we can't provide any guarantees. All right, I hope this video showed the level of insights you can gain from an assessment report. Remember, there's a sample report you can obtain and other case studies to view. From here, you might like to return to the alternatives page to perhaps select a different alternative market and generate another assessment report. Be sure to check out other videos in this series and the other help pages Sell or Hold has online.